Now, I'm really pleased for the first section of the show to have an interview with John Pring, who wrote an amazing book that I would compare with Orwell in the way that it shows exactly what happened with government cuts to welfare and the link with the deaths of hundreds or thousands of disabled people. Um, uh, he did an interview with me, and I've edited it, and I'm just going to play that now. There has been a story this morning about a possible U-turn by the government. I'll talk about that after the interview. I'm joined on the Crispin Flintoff show by John Pring. How are you doing, John?
I'm good, thanks.
I've read most of your book, which I would compare with Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, not just in detail within the book, but the fact that it's so well written. It's incredible to read. It's easy to read. I really suggest that people, if you haven't read it yet or got a copy, that you go and buy The Department, How a Violent Government Bureaucracy Killed Hundreds and Hid the Evidence.
I'd spent kind of nearly a decade researching the deaths caused by Department for Work and Pensions, DWP. I knew at the time it was going to be a huge undertaking to put the book together, but I mean, it was clear, and we're talking kind of 2020, 2021, it was clear that disabled people were continuing to die, and DWP was unable or unwilling to carry out the reforms necessary to make the social security system safe. I just heard too many kind of distressing, traumatic stories and listened to too many grieving relatives to ignore the story any longer. And so I knew someone had to write the book, and after all the research I'd already carried out, I thought it probably should be me. I built up these close relationships with the families, about 12 families. I kind of exposed quite a lot of the evidence that had emerged over the previous decade. Secret reviews the DWP had carried out, prevention of future deaths reports written by coroners that linked the department's assessment process and the suicides of two disabled men.
You do write you've got a constantly updating a website on what's happening every day or every week. So you've been doing this for how long have you been? Can you tell us about the website?
Yeah, it's Disability News Service. It's been going since April 2009, so we're coming up to the 16th anniversary. And it's very much about amplifying the voices of disabled people in their campaigns and their actions, and hearing their voices on issues concerning them. So, I mean, it's not just about disability, poverty and benefits. It's independent living, arts and culture, accessible transport's huge at the moment, inclusive education, housing, accessible housing. Christ, there's another massive scandal. Social care, obviously, is, independent living is another big one. So, yeah. So that comes out every week on a Thursday, and I've got subscribers. So send my stories out to them, and then put them on my website a little bit later on Thursday. So, yeah.
I mean, there must have been a big undertaking for you to keep up the weekly website and to write the book as well. But obviously you had all the information from all your work before that, but to get it all together, big.
Those 2-3 years were intense. I didn't have very many weekends free. That's for sure.
I mean, the book's title is The Government Bureaucracy. It's saying effectively that it isn't the politicians that were running it. It was the bureaucracy. Is that an important thing that you're making, a point that you're making there?
Yeah, it is. I mean, obviously the politicians and the private sector, the outsourcing contractors played a huge part, and none of this would have happened without politicians, and there was a lot of dishonesty from the politicians, and still is. But the general thesis of the book is that this is the violence built very slowly from the early 1990s. There was a culture within that department of harm that built over the years, and it's still there, and that my argument is what has led to those hundreds and probably thousands of deaths in the 2010s that are still continuing now. So it's something that I worked with Dr. China Mills on a couple of projects, including the deaths by welfare timeline, which was really significant and gave me a kick to start work on the book. And she introduced this idea of slow bureaucratic violence to me, and it wasn't her original idea, but there's a bit right at the start of the book from. So this is an academic from the States called Rob Nixon, who wrote this in the context of environmental harm. And he said, by slow violence, I mean violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. And he wrote this brilliant book about slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor about 10 years ago now. And that's exactly what happened here. It was, it's not generally viewed as violence, what these government department did, because it's so slow, it's out of sight, it's bureaucratic. You don't see what's happening behind the scenes. But it's, like he said, it's delayed destruction. And that delayed destruction really, there were deaths in the 1990s, a few, and probably in the 2000s, or we don't know about them yet. But it just exploded into violence in the post-2010 years. Austerity, I guess, was, combined with that violence, it just exploded.
The thing about it is you don't only describe how it was organized politically, I mean, within the bureaucracy, how they sort of used the politicians, in a sense, to push through these reforms that killed people. But you've also got incredibly moving chapters about the people who died, which it's heartbreaking to read these chapters. This is actually a very good intro to the whole book. It's the first part of the introduction, which is this story here from
Philippa Day.
Philippa Day. 2019. I'm not dying because I'm suicidal, and that sounds ridiculous. It's pragmatic. Yes, a dead mum and a shit father will hurt my child for the rest of his life, but that's better than watching mummy go in and out of hospital, crying every day, being triggered every day. I dragged myself up from the bottom basically every 24 hours for just over 27 years. I've been so trapped for so long, and then comes along the government people would assume are there to help. Since January the 11th, 2019, my benefits have been severely cut. This has caused me to get payday loans to simply live, and that has escalated into a hole I can never get out of. Having nothing has isolated me even more from the world, has affected my identity. I haven't had a haircut for over a year, for fuck's sake. This time feels different. I'm scared. Please protect my son from this awful world. There is hope for his future. That's Imogen Day. She's going to change the world. Thank fuck for that. My name is Philippa Day. I'm a good person. I'm strong as fuck. I'm a damn good mother when I had the opportunity. Tess, I'm sorry. I tried. I really did. This is all pointless. I don't even know why I'm writing this. Like it matters. I'm sorry. Peace out. 12/02/92 till 8th of the 8th. 2019. And it's not often in the book that you have notes from people, because often it's just that they find someone's body, and I mean that's absolutely horrific that people actually find someone dead with no food at all, particularly in the house.
The government can't say, "Oh, this is just a one-off." It's just circumstances, just awful coincidence, awful tragedy, but it keeps happening. And then obviously there's also the many suicides as well, and lots of other harm as well caused by this process. Not people dying. It's people causing immense harm to their mental well-being. I mean, I've had I would normally, over the course of a year, I guess I would get maybe one email every month or two from someone saying that they're really suicidal because of what the DWP is doing to them, and just the last week because of the proposed cuts I've had. I'm getting off about 10 now. So it doesn't sound like a huge number, but remember, not very many people will be aware of what I do.
Yeah.
So if you multiply that by how many people are out there, these are really, really worrying figures, and they absolutely terrify me at the moment. You can't ignore the evidence out there, which is that these cuts that look as if they're going to come next week are really concerning and going to have a really significant impact on people's mental health, and will lead to deaths. They will lead to deaths. If this is what they're going to do, they will lead to deaths. They will lead to more deaths, just like the ones I've written about in my book. And that absolutely terrifies me, and it terrifies a lot of people.
You're in a difficult situation because you don't want to make people more fearful, but you also have to tell people what's going on. So,
Yeah.
and that isn't being done by the media. Do you think the media is actually telling the stories as they should? I mean, you wrote a book about this. Obviously, you wouldn't have written a book about it if the media was doing its job, would you?
No, exactly. And I don't think the media is accurately reflecting the mainstream media. I mean, it's obviously the independent media is doing a pretty good job, and some small parts of the mainstream media are doing an okay job, but they're not accurately reflecting facts. They are not accurately reflecting the fact that there is no evidence for what the government is doing. There's no evidence to show that what they are planning to do, these cuts, are merited and that they will help. There is lots of evidence to suggest that they will cause significant harm. They also, one of the things that's really struck me in the last week or two is that the ministers and the Prime Minister keep talking about out of work benefits. Got to get people back in work. It's a moral case. The main cuts we've heard of are PIP. PIP has nothing to do with employment, other than the fact that it helps people stay in work because it meets their extra costs. PIP's got nothing to do with employment. So government has been really dishonest. And I was watching, oh God, was it the BBC's newscast last night? And I could not believe the nonsense they were talking about these cuts. It kept on going on about out of work benefits, but they're talking about PIP. PIP is £5 billion coming out of PIP. PIP has nothing to do with employment. It's not going to help people get back to work by cutting PIP. I couldn't believe these are some of the best journalists in the BBC, and I could not. I had to switch it off in the end. I just couldn't cope anymore. And they talk about the moral case for these cuts, and it is immoral to make disabled people pay the price for what they're doing. Immoral, absolutely immoral.
It's clear that people are going to be in despair, and the government is not budging on this. It seems they are sticking to this idea they have to make cuts. How do you compare this government with former governments? Is this just the same, or is this a scale that's greater than you've seen?
No, it's a really interesting question. It is a cycle. I think, in my opinion, it's a cycle, and I think the evidence shows it's a cycle. So we had the same pattern with the Conservatives in the early 1990s, and then the new Labour government from 1997 through the 2000s, and then the coalition, particularly in the post-2010 years, and again in the early 2020s, and now another new Labour government. So the pattern's always the same, right? So the DWP, or the old DSS, they contact their friendly journalists, usually on the right of the political spectrum, persuade them to write pieces kind of wailing about increasing spending on disability benefits, soften up the public. Then ministers join in, blame benefit claimants for the country's financial problems, insisting that they need to be firm but fair, benefits are spiralling ever upwards. And then they introduce this strict regime, harsher assessments, tougher sanctions if the claimant doesn't comply, and then people start to die. So it's the same department doing the same things it's done for more than 30 years. And you can look at it, right? I was looking at this again last night in preparation, and this 20% figure is really interesting. So 1995, Peter Lilly, who was the Conservative Social Security Secretary, talked about, and this wasn't the PIP forerunner. This was the out of work disability benefit. So it was invalidity benefit that we're going to put it onto incapacity benefit. And he was saying it was likely that about 20% of those who previously qualified would not do so under the new process, right? Fast forward 2010, George Osborne, new austerity chancellor under the Tory coalition, was whinging about disability living allowance being £11 billion a year. So he announces cuts of 20% to spending on working age, DLA, at the emergency budget in June 2010. And now we fast forward to today, we're talking about 5 billion in cuts to PIP. Now, the 23-24 spending on PIP was about 21.7 billion, I believe. So again, 5 billion, that's about 20%. So that's the same proportion as it was in 2010 under Osborne and in 1995 under Peter Lilly. This 20% figure seems to be the figure that the DWP and its predecessors always go for. So maybe they do that in conjunction with the Treasury, I don't know. We'll find out in 20 years' time, I guess, when the memos are in the National Archives. But that seems to be the figure that they always alight on. It's big enough to keep the Treasury happy, but it's not so big that, you know, people will be marching with their pitchforks down Whitehall. They think that's just about as much as they can get away with. It seems to be the same figure every time, 20%.
Isn't this an issue of, you know, will those Labour politicians or politicians in general get a backbone and speak up against the bureaucrats who are telling them to cause the death of countless people that we've seen and we've written about? Isn't that what we should be saying? I mean, those people are not originating this policy. This isn't from Liz Kendall or whoever else they put at the front of it. It's from someone else, and they should be told, you know, why can't you just say no to those bureaucrats?
And again, we go back to, oh God, I think it was late 97. I think it was really in the first year of the new Labour government. And they brought in those awful, they were talking about awful benefit cuts at the time. And again, there's minutes from the cabinet meeting that are in the National Archives. And they show that Tony Blair was doing the same thing. He was having meetings with backbench MPs. I mean, I don't think this is a big secret. He was having meetings with backbench MPs, trying to persuade them, and ministers were saying, we have to do this. It's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. I don't know if he used the word moral, but he was getting pretty close to it in the minutes, from what I remember. So yeah, they are doing that now. I don't know. Every one of the 650 MPs cross parties got a copy of my book. There was a brilliant fundraising effort by crowdfunded by disabled activists, people like John McArdle and Ellen Clifford were behind it, and it was absolutely fantastic. And they raised enough money. We delivered the books to Parliament in September. I found it really difficult to even get MPs to acknowledge that they'd received that book. They really didn't want to admit they'd got the evidence, which is really shocking when disabled people raised the money to do that. Just said, right, here's the evidence. So you've got it. We know the welfare reforms are coming. We know the cuts are coming to social security. Here's a book that shows the damage that's been done in the past and could be done again.
The other thing is that what's happening in this country has been under observation from the United Nations, who have been critical of this government. I mean, not this government, the last government, but obviously this government's going further than the last government. So what have the United Nations been saying about the way that the government's treating disabled people?
Yeah, so it's not. So the main committee that we've been interested in over the years, and again, disabled activists, and I make it absolutely clear here, my work followed my book. We really couldn't have happened without the work of grassroots disabled activists. I just built on what they'd done in the early years, the post-2010 years. They were way ahead of what I was doing, way ahead. And they managed to get the UN Committee on the Rights of Disabled People to investigate the UK in the early mid 2010s. And that committee twice found the UK guilty of grave and systematic violations of what's called the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's its official name. Largely because of its DWP failures, disability, poverty and benefits. And then they came back again 12 months ago, and they were again finding it. There's still grave and systematic violations. And they talked about, the committee actually said 12 months ago they were appalled by reports of deaths linked to benefit claims, the disturbingly consistent theme following denial of adequate support. And then earlier this month, another UN committee on economic, social and cultural rights concluded that the welfare reforms introduced in 2012, 2016 had disproportionately affected disabled people, low-income families, workers in precarious employment. And it called for, right, so they called for increased spending on social security and for the government to take corrective measures, just as this government is preparing to cut social security. The government, as it's preparing to cut benefits again, disability benefits again, is refusing to comment on the conclusions of that committee. I've tried last week, tried the week before. They're just not. They just give this ridiculous statement about their benefit reforms. They are not commenting on the conclusions by that UN committee and whether they will follow their recommendations. So, I mean, I think that's pretty disturbing, but it doesn't surprise me. It's a DWP.
Finally, on this, it's like manslaughter that we're talking about, and that's probably the kindest way of putting it. For what the governments have been doing since, you say, John Major's government on this issue, is there any chance that there could be justice found for those people's deaths? Do you think that's something that we should be looking at in the long term?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's one of my big targets for this year is to push for a public inquiry into the deaths over the years. And there's a lot of support for it. And John McDonnell put down a brilliant early day motion, got support from 19 MPs, but that's without the Lib Dems. And the Lib Dems are making some interesting noises on work and pensions and around the DWP. Steve Darling, their new spokesperson, who's a disabled person himself, thinks the DWP should be scrapped and replaced, which is further than his party's gone in the past. I'm hoping to persuade him over the course of the next months to support a public inquiry. Families support a public inquiry. A lot of the disabled activists support a public inquiry. But we'll see. I mean, there should be, right? There are laws for misconduct in public office, and I think there is definitely evidence. There's evidence out there that would prove a case for misconduct in public office against some senior civil servants and past ministers.
Well, I learned a lot from speaking to John Pring. The thing that alarmed me most was the fact that the bureaucrats are running the show a bit like sort of Yes Minister, telling the ministers what to do. Effectively, Liz Kendall and those people are just puppets of the bureaucracy, acting for them, being sort of their PR. And so when I saw this story today on the BBC, I think it's like the headline of the whole BBC news page. Plan to freeze PIP disability benefits may be dropped. Ministers are considering abandoning plans to freeze some disability benefits, the BBC understands. Now, if you read this story, that towards the end of the story, this is a quote, and I found this really interesting. A Department for Work and Pension spokesman said, and this is the word that means a lot to me, it says, the Department of Work and Pension spokesman said, we have been clear that the current welfare system is broken and needs reform so that it helps long-term sick and disabled people who can work to find employment, ensuring people receive the support they need while being fair to the taxpayer. Without reform, more people will be locked out of jobs despite many wanting to work. That is not just bad for the economy, it's bad for people too. How can a bureaucrat come out with a moral statement about how work is good for people too. They are supposed to just do the bidding of MPs and ministers. They don't say we. They don't tell people what works about what's good for them. I honestly think that it's so clear to me that the Department of Work and Pensions are the people we should be pressurising. I mean, Liz Kendall's just a puppet, an idiot. And MPs who go along with what the bureaucracy is saying are a disgrace. They've got no moral backbone whatsoever. We'll see what happens. But anyway, it's really interesting to speak to John Pring, and just alarming that we're being deceived about what's actually going on.